Good afternoon. My name is Tino Cuellar, and I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm pleased that so many of you could join us today in person and online. Many of you know our Africa program director, Dr. Zainab Usman, and when she asked me to do something, I try to do it, so I'm here. But of course, I'm here for many reasons. I'm here because our institution is about global cooperation and governance. And I cannot imagine us being able to advance our mission without a robust focus on Africa. Last autumn, the Biden administration released its Africa strategy. Strategy told a story of sorts, that American leaders believe Africa to be enormously important, both to U.S. interests and to global well-being. And that's a story told through data. By 2050, the continent will be home to 25% of the world's population and an even larger proportion of its workforce. Africa hosts the world's second largest rainforest and has 30% of the world's critical minerals. African countries comprise one of the world's largest voting groups at the UN General Assembly, 28% of all the votes, and holds 3 non-permanent seats on the UN Security Council. All this makes a difference to policymakers in Washington and throughout Africa. At the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, countries announced new initiatives and funding related to Africa's digital transformation, the space economy, food security, and the energy transition. For us at Carnegie, it's clear that Africa is also important to the world's future because it will play an active role in shaping that future. Take subnational governance. African cities have grown by 500 million people over the last 30 years, making them the fastest growing collection of cities in the world. The policies tested on issues like land use, for example, green energy, will contain lessons for cities from Singapore to San Francisco. Or consider the climate crisis, which requires us to dramatically curb emissions at the very moment that more than 2 billion people around the world have their sights set on joining the global middle class. As home to 3/4 of the world's unelectrified population, the test of our ability to support a just energy transition that benefits both the planet and its people will run through Africa. Finally, consider the continent's dynamic and growing technological footprint. Cities across Africa are emerging as important hubs for technology development and business innovation. In 2020, even as COVID-19 was testing the economy, Africa was the world's fastest growing venture capital market. And the continent boasts an estimated 700,000 professional software developers, by some accounts, more than the state of California. At the same time, geopolitical shifts have highlighted that African countries do not and never have acted as a monolith. This is clear in South Africa's recent joint military exercises with Russia and China, Egypt and Ethiopia's entrance to the BRICS bloc, or the fact that some African countries have positioned themselves as independent mediators between Russia and Ukraine. All this reinforces that we should take stock in the U.S.'s engagement with Africa at the 1-year mark since the launch of the U.S. Africa strategy. For a candid discussion of these very themes, it is my pleasure to welcome the best panel in town you could possibly imagine for this. We have Molly McPhee, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Welcome. Judd Devermont, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council. Ambassador Johnny Carson, the Special Presidential Representative for U.S. Africa Leaders Summit implementation. And Joseph Asunka, the CEO of Afrobarometer, a Pan-African nonpartisan survey research network that conducts public attitude surveys. And Ambassador Elsie Kanza, representing the United Republic of Tanzania to the United States and Mexico. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. And now, Zainab Usman, you have the floor, and I promise you all you're in good hands with Zainab.
Thank you very much, Tino. Good day, everyone. You seem a bit low energy. We have coffee outside. This is an exciting event. Welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and thank you so much for those excellent welcome remarks, Tino. My name is Zainab Usman. I'm the founding director of the Africa program. I'm delighted to welcome you to this important policy dialogue on U.S. Africa relations. We have a very, very full house today, as you can see, our distinguished panelists, the guests joining us physically, and those joining us virtually from all around the world. I'm very glad to see this interest in the defining issues shaping the African continent today and into the future. You know, it is often said that Africa is not that important in DC. That's not necessarily true, as we can see today. A key objective of our work here at the Carnegie Africa program is to engage policymakers and scholars to help shape global discourse and policy on Africa. We facilitate policy dialogues between African stakeholders and their counterparts here in the US, in Europe, in Asia, and indeed other parts of the world to advance ideas that will meaningfully promote beneficial partnerships, prosperity, and equal opportunity. As you know, in August 2022, the Biden administration announced the new US strategy towards Sub-Saharan Africa. And then in December 2022, the US bolstered the strategic objectives identified in the strategy with a pledge of $55 billion during the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. Since the summit in December, I'm sure you'll agree with me that a lot has happened around the world, and indeed, with respect to U.S. Africa relations. There have been high-level visits to various African countries by senior US government officials. The global economic environment is more turbulent than ever. There have been elections in countries from Nigeria to Zimbabwe, as well as sudden military interventions from Niger to Gabon. The African Union has been officially welcomed as a member of the G20, while Ethiopia and Egypt have been invited to join the BRICS group. So really an eventful year. Then the question is, how much progress has been made towards realizing some of the strategy's core aims? What systems and processes have been constructed to implement the outcomes of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit? How might recent developments such as electoral transitions and economic and geopolitical factors enable or constrain progress? And at the end of it all, what do Africans think of the strategy, its implementation, and really the broader relationship between the United States and Africa? These are some of the questions that we hope to address in today's policy dialogue with the senior representatives from the US government, members of the African Diplomatic Corps, and the policy community to get a sense of the shifts and the continuities in US-Africa relations. I would now like to welcome our distinguished panelists, starting with Ambassador Molly Fee. Could you please come and join us on the stage? A round of applause.
Which way would you like me to walk?
This way. It might be easier. Maybe that way. Excellent. Third seat over there. And then Mr. Judd Devermont. Ambassador Johnny Carson. Ambassador Elsie Kanza. And Dr. Joe Asonka. Hopefully we're not going to need the microphone. So before we start, I want to walk you through what we'll be doing over the next maybe 1 hour, 15 minutes or so. We're going to devote about 40 minutes to a discussion with our distinguished panelists. It is a full panel, but obviously they all have very crucial insights to share. And then we'll open up for questions and answers for another 20 minutes before we close for the day. So I want to start with you, Mr. Devermont. You are one of the key architects of the strategy. Let me just be very blunt. What has happened since last year? what has been implemented, and what areas do you think need a bit more boost and support?
Okay, it sounds like you want a report card. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us. It's so nice to see a lot of friends and colleagues. It makes me more nervous about the Q&A, though. So let me take a step back in terms of writing the strategy. We decided that it's a point of pride, the policy that we have had towards Africa across administrations. It's a bipartisan one, and it's really been in effect since the mid-90s. But we thought in this moment in time, it was important to reevaluate and reassess, determine what we want to retain and what we want to evolve. Because the continent has changed dramatically over the last 30 years, and certainly the world is changing in very, very quickly and very rapidly and in dramatic ways. President Biden calls it an inflection point in the national security strategy. We talk about this as a decisive decade. So we did a lot of consultations with our embassies in the field and with, I think, every single person here on this panel and many of you to kind of think about what do we need to do next. And we kind of reached three big conclusions. First, that Africa is and increasingly will be critical to making the decisions about sort of the future of our international community. That on every single priority issue for our government, for our people, for African governments, African peoples, that the continent has to be at the table, whether that's climate change or food insecurity or really defining the rules of the road on trade, emerging technology, and cyber. So that was sort of one big conclusion that we made. The second one is that we have to reset our relationships to a degree with the continent. We needed to inject a little more complexity into the relationship. Sure, we should talk about all the things that we agree on, but we also should not be afraid to talk about the things that we disagree on. My view is that durable solutions come from disagreement. So engage, have this complexity. Think about engaging not just African governments, but African publics, thought leaders, diaspora. Think about engaging not just the biggest states, but small and medium states, and expanding our engagement not just with the European countries, former colonial powers, but really thinking about Africa's place in the Indo-Pacific, in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Red Sea. So that was the second conclusion. And the third one was really, if the continent is changing, are our policies matching a region that is increasingly young, increasingly connected, and increasingly urban? So those were the sort of the three things that we, I think, animate the rest of the strategy. There's a lot of the things that you would see in every U.S. strategy, but I thought those sort of cut across the document. In terms of how we've done, I'm very proud of the effort that we have undertaken to integrate Africa into the conversation at the global level. That if we are going to write the rules of our global community, that Africa needs a seat at the table. And we've made that step in a whole bunch of different ways. So, of course, President Biden made a commitment that there should be an African seat at the Security Council. President Biden at the Africa Leaders Summit called for the AU to join as a permanent member of the G20, which happened just in India a couple weeks ago. We have talked about how do we reform the MDBs and the international financial institutions so Africa has a larger voice. So I think if you just take a moment and look at just the last G7, G20, UN General Assembly, if you look at the activities that we have done, the president talked about in all of those speeches the enormous investments we're making, for example, in the Libido Port Corridor, which connects Angola to Congo to Zambia. We called out President Ruto for his prominent role in addressing the challenges in Haiti. We had a number of African countries join our declaration on Atlantic cooperation. And this is something that Molly and I are committed to continue to do throughout the year, is find new opportunities to lift up African voices and make sure that as we define the future, that Africans are in the conversation at the table. So I think I'm very happy with that part. More to do, but I think that's progress. I think we're still working on the programs that really befit a continent that is young, connected, and urban. We have an alphabet soup of incredible programs from PEPFAR to MCC to AGOA, but we also need to keep creating new programs. So we're very proud of the Digital Transformation with Africa. It's an $800 million program invested in or focused on upskilling, and creating an enabling environment. If you look at that program plus Other initiatives like other investments like $250 million or $300 million, excuse me, into data centers in Ghana, or the Vice President's call to action to create a philanthropic and private sector arm for DTA. That's over $1 billion commitment to private sector, to digital infrastructure, digital economy connections. I, and those of you who know me, are as passionate about urban, and I'd like us to do more on that, but we signed at the UN General Assembly an MCC threshold compact, MCC threshold program with Kenya. It's really exciting looking at urban transportation in Nairobi and land use. So I think we're making some progress, but that's how I would give us grades. I think we're in the right direction on all of these, and there are places where we like to, I think, intensify and keep moving forward.
Very, very interesting. You spoke about some of the programming within the context of the strategic framework, and I want to bring in Ambassador Fee here. It's one thing to look at the long term, this long-term vision in terms of how the U.S. wants to engage and rethink its relationship to Africa or with Africa. But then there are day-to-day developments, which I know you deal with in the Bureau of African Affairs. So how is this strategic reorientation, as articulated in the document that Judd just walked us through, translating into the day-to-day operations within the Africa Bureau of the State Department? But also, how do you balance this implementation of the long-term strategic framework with more recent events, whether it's the military interventions that have happened, the kind of complex electoral transitions also in countries like Nigeria and Zimbabwe, the fragile peace agreement in Ethiopia, the situation in the DRC with Rwanda, all of those. How are you kind of balancing the long term with the day-to-day?
Well, thanks, Zainab, for that question, and I think you've just outlined both the challenge and the terror of my position, given how many sentences it took to get through that complex query. I'm going to give Judd a hard time for a moment. The strategy was very important to really make clear the official policy position of the United States that Africa is strategic, I think, which everyone in this room agrees. But I think Joe might tell us that a lot of people might have said, yeah, duh, as we would say in the Midwest. It is strategic, and the U.S. is finally catching up with that reality. So what we've tried to do in the past year or so is to make structural changes, both internally and externally, to help realize that vision. Some of you have heard me say that on the Friday, the last day of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, a very prominent head of state from Africa called me and said, that was a great event. It was really terrific. Don't wait another 8 years. And so when we looked into it, we found out that Ambassador Mike Battle, who's currently serving as our ambassador in Tanzania, had led the effort for the State Department in 2014. And he told me with chagrin that immediately after that summit was concluded, his office was disbanded. So we really needed to start from scratch and establish an office, which we have, which will report to the front office. And we needed to build on priorities identified by the Secretary and the President. So you know the State Department has now established a Bureau of Global Health Security. That will help, and we hope, ensure the continuation of the massively successful U.S. investment in health in Africa, whether it's the sort of lodestar PEPFAR program, our President's malaria initiative, what we did to try and respond to the COVID crisis. So there's a lot of effort underway to consolidate the work that we do in health, because as everybody knows, if you don't have good health, you can't have good development. Secretary is also extremely interested in food security. We've had the flagship program, Feed the Future, which has done so much to contribute to the development of productivity in Africa, which is only going to become more important given climate change and given anticipated demands for food production. So he hired one of the world's leading agronomists, Dr. Carrie Fowler, who's developed this incredibly innovative program to identify climate-resistant seeds and to use soil mapping to find soils where the seeds can grow and increase productivity. So we've invested in food security to improve on, again, a pre-existing program that was so helpful to others. As Judd said, we really understand we had a successful Africa Business Forum at the Leaders Summit where billions of dollars in deals were discussed. Now we need to turn those into reality. But we understand that if the fundamentals aren't addressed, if African needs, which have soared as a result of conflict, as a result of COVID, in terms of access to capital, in terms of access to liquidity, if those fundamental problems aren't resolved, then we're not going to be able to have the kind of success we would have in driving more American investment and trade with Africa. So that's why you see Secretary Yellen doing a lot, the administration proposing new funding and new authorities to Congress for the World Bank and the IMF to sort of leverage their capabilities for us, in effect, to guarantee their loans to do more to help African leaders respond to what they tell us is their number one priority for infrastructure and investment in such sectors as agriculture. So a third area where we're really trying to focus is to make good on the promise Congress invested in the State Department and the interagency, which is with the Global Fragility Act. And this ties back to the piece of your question, Zainab, about coups and military interventions. I think one of the great aspects of American society is that we have a learning capacity. And what to me was exciting about the work that was done to develop that legislation was a review of the 20 years of U.S. conduct and activity in the wake of 9/11, and the conclusion, which I think everyone here knows, that security is important and essential to progress, but when we overinvest in security and don't pay enough attention on governance and economic development, that those security gains can't be sustained. And so that's what the Global Fragility Act is trying to do in terms of what they've now named. And by the way, I'm going to say to all of you, I call this great idea, bad name, which is the U.S. strategy to promote stability and prevent conflict, which no one can say in English or French or Portuguese. So I encourage all of you I will give anyone a free bottle of whatever they prefer if you can come up with a better name. So in Africa, we're doing that in my patch, we're doing that in Mozambique, and we're doing that in coastal West Africa. So Zainab, I see the immediate challenges that we're facing that you've described as largely a result of decades of inadequate attention, both by Africans and by their partners, on the issues of governance, particularly how to make democracy deliver, and on economic development. And I think we haven't really fully acknowledged as a government in a sustained way the impact of climate change, which I think is driving a lot of the challenges on the continent. So if you were to ask me an area where I wish we could do more, where we haven't done as much as I believe is important, it would be on climate change. We've done some. The administration has ambitious goals, but I don't think as a society and as a government we've done enough. So that's, to me, how I would say we balance both the immediate challenges and the long-term challenges. So what we were trying to do with Johnny's advice and support, with the work that Judd and I do in the interagency, is, again, really make structural change to make durable our commitment to the fact that Africa is strategic and our partnership with Africa matters. So what we've done internally, what we've done externally, and trying to address the key components of I think, structural elements in governments and societies that contribute to the kind of problems we've seen in the past year or so. I hope that helps.
Yeah, very helpful, very insightful. You spoke about some of the structural changes being made in the Bureau, as well as interagency coordination. And I think this is a good time to bring in Ambassador Carson. It's been 9 months since the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit was convened. One of the summit's headline announcements was the commitment of a total, or an aggregate of $55 billion across various sectors: human capital, infrastructure, governance, health systems, some of the areas Ambassador Fee just gave us an overview of. These figures, this $55 billion, combines public and private finance as well as pre-existing and new commitments. I suppose the question I'm trying to get at is, in what ways are you working with various other stakeholders, entities within the federal government, but also within Congress? And I know we have a few people from Congress in the audience, to unlock some of these resources in terms of implementing summit commitments.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to be on this very distinguished panel this afternoon. Zainab, when I agreed to come back into government to support the success of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, I was essentially asked to do several things. One of them was to make a series of recommendations on how to institutionalize what had been done in December. And I'd like to focus on that for a second. The second thing that I was asked to do was to help to push forward an effort to ensure that the pledges and commitments that were made at the summit were actually actualized, carried forward, because pledges and commitments are only words in the wind if they're not followed up with direct actions that complete them. The third thing that I was asked to do was something that was announced today with great fanfare, and that was to push forward the creation of the President's Diaspora Engagement Council, which was announced today at midday by the White House. But let me go back to the first and say the structural things that are there. And I do all of these things in cooperation and with the collaboration of Assistant Secretary Fee and Judd, but they are things that I've recommended to ensure that we do a better job of having summits more frequently than the 8-year interval that we had between 2014 and December of 2022. 8 years is too long a gap for those sorts of direct, high-level engagements. Some of the things that I have recommended to both the Secretary and to the NSC have, in fact, included the idea of having summits every 3 years, at least one during every presidential cycle. Second was to have what I call mini summits or city summits in the interim between those 3-year intervals, where there would be high-level summits that would focus on digital technology, for example, manufacturing, agro-processing, urbanization, climate, in which there would be high-level visits, presidential and ministerial visits, of people coming to the United States at the invitation of the White House, engaged in those intervening years on high-level engagements. I also recommended, and Molly has followed through very quickly, the creation of a cell or an office in her front office with 4 individuals who will be working on summit implementation along with the NSC. They'll have other responsibilities as well, but they will be focused on working to prepare for the next round of events and activities. In order to keep the African diplomatic corps informed both in Washington and overseas, we've recommended that at the annual U.S. Africa meetings with the chair of the Africa Commission, that there be a day set aside for a review of the progress, specifically of the commitments that were made in December of 22, so that the chair of the AU and the commissioners would hear from senior U.S. government officials engaged and involved in those programs about the progress of those programs. So it's another recommendation. All of this has been done in consultation. I've met here in Washington on several occasions with all the members of the African Diplomatic Corps. Judd and I and Molly have sat down at the White House and met with smaller groups of senior African diplomats to share with them what we're doing. I've spoken to the chairman of the AU, Moussa Faki, telephonically. I met with him several days ago in New York to again brief him on the progress that we are making and the structural pieces that we are putting in place to ensure that he is comfortable, that he looks at this as being the kind of thing that is valuable and useful for our African partners. So that's a very, very key thing. On the second point, agreed, there were $55 billion worth of commitments. And I've told people many times that these $55 billion in funding represents a commitment by the administration over a 3-year period. Most of that money, if you will look at it carefully, is to support many of the valuable and very useful programs that have been put in place by the U.S. government over a number of not years, but decades. And this is support for many of our flagship programs. It's our support for PEPFAR, it's our support for MCC, for Power Africa, for Feed the Future. But in addition to the money going into those programs, there have been significant add-ons. Molly mentioned the one for food security. Many of these programs are being boosted and accelerated and expanded to take advantage of the many benefits that have accrued here. One only has to think of the value of what we do in public health and in PEPFAR, for example. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of PEPFAR, and we've saved 25 million lives over that period of time. It's a program, a strong program, continues to need funding. But there are new programs that are out there. I think Judd has mentioned, I think the one that will probably be transformational and will also in the future become a flagship program that we will all be talking about, and that is the digital transformation with Africa. That's a powerful program, $800 million, public-private partnerships. It addresses the most important technological innovation and benefit that people need today to improve their lives in every way. So those kinds of programs are new. Let me finally say something about the Diaspora Engagement Council. This is a program which is designed for the President, the Secretary of State, and the President to hear and take advantage of the voices of the diaspora community in the United States, to strengthen the relationship between the administration and the Black community writ large, and also to take advantage of the enormous knowledge and expertise and energy that exists in the diaspora community to strengthen our relationships with the African communities overseas. The individuals on this council will provide a dynamic and vibrant new voice that will feed into the State Department and into the White House, providing ideas, energy, and initiatives on the way forward and the way we should be moving ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. And I'm sure many of you are aware, but if you're not, the Diaspora Advisory, or is it Engagement Council? Advisory
Yes.
Council was announced. The membership, anyways, was announced earlier today. I think this should be available online.
It is, yeah.
Yes, with the membership and everything. It was one of the key outcomes of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit
It is a deliverable that has been delivered.
that has been delivered. Great way to frame it. I want to bring in Ambassador Elsie Kanza. My question to you is, how is all of what you've heard being received by the government and the people of Tanzania? What has the past year of strategy implementation and also summit implementation entailed when it came to tangibly reshaping or shaping U.S. engagement with your country? How do people in Tanzania just view all of what we're discussing here in DC?
Well, you picked a country which is particularly special with respect to relationships with the U.S. government and people. We have strong diplomatic relations for over 60 years. The U.S. is still and has been our biggest development partner. So in that regard, there are many beneficiaries of engagement with the U.S. government, but particularly with respect to what's happened since last year, particularly when the strategy came out. First, allow me to commend Judd in particular with his team for the consistency, both in terms of consultative meetings before the strategy came out, and these have been reflected in the strategy that did come out. And again, consultations not just with Judd and the National Security Council, but also Ambassador Molifi's team and the rest of the administration in terms of consultations that they had with the ambassadors here in Washington, D.C. We all felt we could have done more, but you always feel like you can do more. But I think it's fair to say that many of the inputs we provided were reflected both in the summit, and then we've all been very open about what went well, what could have gone better, and all very eagerly looking forward to the outcomes of Ambassador Carson's work. And he's an old friend of Africa, so we're glad to have somebody who knows the continent very well, also helping to steer us in that direction. From Tanzania's perspective, just looking at what's changed over the past year, one is we've seen a significant stepping up in terms of high-level engagement, and this we've seen in other parts of the continent. Notably, Her Excellency V. POTUS, Kamala Harris, was in Tanzania in March, one of 3 countries. It was not a country focus, that's very important. It was actually continental focus, but still choosing to be in Tanzania to highlight certain aspects in terms of policy direction and commitment is not something that we take lightly, and again, speaks to the commitment that we have in terms of our relationship and the commitments to the continent. During her visit, a number of important agreements were signed. They were all government to government, one of which was an MOU with U.S. Exim Bank, which again is strengthening this commitment to leverage instruments available in the U.S. to support private sector engagement that is working hand in hand and complementing our public sector relationships. We've had other visits by high-level officials, such as the Honorable Joel Brunau, who is the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Honorable Marisa Lago, and the Secretary of Commerce for International Trade, as well as Honorable Samantha Powers from the USAID Administrator. And just last month in August, we had a congressional delegation led by Representative John James, who is chair of the Africa Subcommittee. And then allow me to just highlight as well something significant with respect to food security. We hosted the AGRF Africa Food System Summit, had over 5,000 delegates, over 70 countries represented, and the US had a substantive delegation present. Again, yes, it happened in Tanzania, but it was also a commitment to the continent, and we look forward to the announcements that will be coming up. But again, it's just to demonstrate the commitment in terms of mobilizing, because you had over 20 people from the US and others from around the continent. It's just how serious they are about this. The second aspect I wish to highlight is with respect to support to democratic reforms. Tanzania is one of the beneficiaries of the Democracy Delivers initiative that was launched in September last year during the UNGA. It's a deliberate effort by USAID, again, to leverage resources and other stakeholder participation, particularly by philanthropic foundations, It's to back up what the governments are doing and to make sure that the democratic reforms actually translate into dividends as far as the public is concerned. And we've seen, again, in this area, significant step up as per the announcements last week. The country remains, and with my president, Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, committed to continuing to advance reforms to deepen and broaden democracy in Tanzania. So in this regard, also very significant presence and appreciation of this recognition, if I can call it that, by the U.S. government. And they had a very gracious press release, so it's easy to see what Tanzania benefited from, but it was not the only country, and it's certainly not the only country in Africa that is being recognized and encouraged on this important pathway. Had Asia and Latin America as well. And the third aspect is with respect to increased private sector engagement. We've seen an increase in trade missions and reverse trade missions. Personally, I'm pushing for virtual trade missions where possible, because this was one of the areas where we could have done better if, given the constraints that we had, it wasn't possible to do so. But this was in terms of participation by the African private sector in particular during the U.S. Africa Business Forum. There was a limit on numbers, and what that means is that there's an eagerness to engage and have that on a continuous basis. What I've also discovered with my team is that there's both ignorance and a willingness to be educated, both by American investors as well as by Tanzanian investor community, just to understand, what is Prosper Africa, what is U.S. Exim Bank, how can I leverage that, what is USTDA doing. AmCham in Tanzania has done a great job in collaboration with the U.S. Embassy, where they've organized a number of meetings. We're encouraging them to do webinars where they're just unpacking what these institutions are, what it means with respect to engaging in Tanzania, but they're doing this across the continent as well. And we look forward to seeing the outcomes of that. It's too early to tell yet at this stage whether we're seeing a significant uptick in terms of trade and investment, but it's definitely something that we're keen to see materialize.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I want to, great to hear, all of what you've been doing, but also, how that relationship between the U.S. and Tanzania is just becoming stronger with the concrete initiatives you've mentioned. I want to bring in Dr. Asunka, and to kind of zoom out a bit beyond Tanzania, to just get a better sense of what the rest of Africa and other Africans think of the relationship with the U.S. and the U.S. strategy and all of what has been happening over the past 1 year. I know Afrobarometer, your organization, recently concluded its ninth round of surveys. What findings can you highlight from that round of surveys in terms of the U.S.-Africa relationship, what Africans are prioritizing, and just what the continent thinks?
Right. Yeah, thanks so much, Zainab, and thanks for having us. I think I would speak from the podium if you permit me.
I think he has a few slides, just a few slides.
All right, thank you so much, and I'm glad that the panelists can see what I'm going to share here. So I'm going to throw a few numbers at you, and then, of course, I may not cover all the trend that many of you may have questions about. I'm happy to respond to those questions, but more importantly, to share some of the numbers that are connected with what has been discussed here so far. Just briefly, for Afrobarometer, this is a Pan-African survey research network. We conduct surveys across the continent. Currently, we are into 39 countries. And actually, the ninth round of the survey that Zainab just mentioned, this is the first time the Afrobarometer has covered up to 39 countries, the highest number so far. And I keep giving kudos to my team back on the continent who work tirelessly to make sure that the voices of Africans are reflected in debates and discussions like this. And I know Jad started and mentioned about the Afrobarometer, and I really want to appreciate that as well, the consultations and the conversations that led to the development of the strategy. I'll show you some diagrammatic mapping here that gives you that intersection between the Afrobarometer questions and how the strategy was actually framed. So we have one goal, to give Africans a voice. And I'm glad that the African Union is now part of the G20. Of course, African voices are being reflected in some of these discussions. That has become very important for us at the Afrobarometer. We have 3 objectives. One is that we make sure that we have good quality data and we put it there in the public domain so the data is out there for everybody to use. It's a public good. All our publications are all available and free to access on our website. If I don't cover any topic and you go to our website, you should be able to see a lot more than what I'm going to touch on here. The second is to make sure that we share this data as widely as possible with policy actors, academics, researchers, and the like across the globe. And I'm glad to be doing this with you today. The final one is building capacity on the continent to be able to continue to do this work. So survey research, analysis, and engaging with policy actors to ensure that data and evidence can be used in policy making. All right, so how have we done this? When the strategy first came out, what we did was to take the strategy and look at the overall objectives of the strategy and look at the goals that the strategy has laid out, the U.S. strategy towards Africa, and see how the Afrobarometer questions actually maps onto those strategic goals. And so we've done this for the entire strategy. So what it means is that Afrobarometer continues to have data that can be used to actually track progress of the implementation of the strategy. That is, how Africans are feeling about the implementation of some of the programs that Molifi and Jad just mentioned, as well as Ambassador Carson's work thinking about the implementation of the U.S. Africa Summit commitments. So if you look at this diagram here, of course, we do have the specific goals: promoting individual freedoms and media freedoms, combating corruption, facilitating access to information, and promoting law and independence, rule of law and independence of the judiciary. We do have questions that map directly onto these. So this is the first strategic objective of the U.S. The few things I'm going to highlight are in the green. I'm just going to give you a snippet of what the findings are from the current round and also over time what the trends have been on some of these topics. So the first one is about media freedom. So what is the media landscape like on the continent? In general, there seems to be a sense of people feeling that they can express themselves, and this is on average. So on average, across the continent, almost 7 in 1 Africans feel they can express themselves without being controlled. But then, this is the continental average, you should know, because across the country, there's a lot of variation, from as high as almost 90% in places like the Gambia, but also as low as 25%. Only a quarter of the people of Eswatini feel that they can express themselves freely. So as I said, even though the average is very high, there is still some work to do, especially for countries that are at the bottom there. The second piece is, even though on average we have this high number of people feeling that they can express themselves, Africans were freer about 10 years ago than they are today. Because the change in people's perception of freedom of speech has dropped significantly across the continent over the last 10 years. And I think that's one key message we want to send, that even though on average we feel that on the media landscape, and especially freedom of expression, people feel that they are free, that they were freer than they are now. And so we need to do some work on personal freedoms. The second piece is thinking about media freedoms in general. So those were the personal freedoms. Here is media freedom. On the continent, there's also good news that Africans strongly support media freedom. They want the media to be able to report without being controlled by government. And this is on average 65%. Of course, it does vary, but even in the countries where it is low, it's still more than 40% of the population being supportive of media freedom. But there's more good news. The more good news is that over the last decade, the support for media freedom has actually grown in most countries. At some point, we saw media freedom actually dropping. That's the support for media freedom. But when we compare to 10 years ago, people are more supportive of media freedom now than they were 10 years ago. So that's another piece of good news. But generally on the continent, when we ask people about whether or not they think the media is actually free, the story is a bit mixed. People don't feel that the media is very free. Of course, we do have a slim majority that thinks that the media is free on the continent, but then it's only a small majority. And of course, If we look across the countries, it varies a lot from places like Tanzania, where the media is very free. 80% say the media is free. I'm happy that the ambassador is here. Yes. But of course, countries like Gabon, where it is almost very small, less than 15% saying that the media is free in that country. All right, so generally that seems like in the media landscape, there seem to be, when it comes to freedoms, there seem to be some level of confidence in personal freedoms. There's strong support for media freedom, but we want to underscore the fact that these freedoms, especially personal freedoms, have actually declined. And I hope that as part of the implementation of the U.S. strategy, this is an area that needs some attention. The second piece is the big, elephant in the room, corruption. That has always been a big issue on the continent. And the one I want to focus on is corruption in the office of the president. This is always one of the key indicators we track. There's generalized corruption, but corruption in the office of the president. What we've seen is that it actually increased over just between 2019 and to date. There has been an increase in people's perception of corruption in the office of the president just in the last 3 years. But the biggest increases have occurred actually in Ghana, Nigeria, Ghana and Nigeria in particular. Those are where we have really large increases. Of course, there are increases in other countries, but I think these are the two countries where we've seen a big increase. But the good news is that in some countries, their perceptions have actually dropped, especially in Zambia and Mali. There has been a decline in people's perception of corruption in the office of the president. All right, but the risk, and I think this is the message I want to share, is that people generally feel that they would be retaliated if they report corruption. And I think this is something that needs to be at some attention because people are very fearful of reporting corruption if it happens. And so here, if we do need to have mechanisms in place that would allow citizens to be able to report corruption, otherwise the fight against corruption may not yield the results that we hope for. All right, the second key U.S. strategic objective is to deliver democratic and security dividends on the continent. And as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, that's the Afrobarometer indicators that map on. So we have a rich set of data that speaks to these topics. But I'm just going to mention two of them for the sake of time. The first is support for democratic governance. The good news, Africans are solidly behind democracy and they reject authoritarian alternatives. So one-man rule, one-party rule is rejected very highly, and it has been consistent ever since we started the surveys. The only indicator that has dropped a little, and I should say significantly, is the rejection of military rule. I'm not saying that Africans support military rule. I'm just saying that the rate at which they rejected military rule 10 years ago is much higher than they do today. So it's a 10 percentage point drop since then, but there's still a solid majority support for rejection of military rule, I should say. Okay. So support for democracy is still high, and the rejection of authoritarian alternatives are pretty high as well. Same with all the institutions and norms that we normally would associate with democracy, whether it is elections, multi-party competition, and the like. Africans are solidly behind these commitments and these norms. And I think this is also good news for us because on the continent, on the demand side, we haven't seen any decline in the rate at which people support some of these democratic institutions. So that is also something that we can continue to build on. I want to zoom in on military rule here because of the current spate of coups on the continent. Of course, rejection of military rule, as I said, is still rejected by a solid majority at 65 or 66%. It just varies. So in Burkina Faso and Mali, rejection of military rule is not that high. But of course, in places like Zambia and Uganda and Eswatini, we have a large majority saying that they reject military rule outright. So the rejection of military rule is not a question. It's just that the rate at which people resisted it 10 years ago was much stronger than it is today. Okay, right. And we asked the question this time around in the 39 countries whether or not the military should intervene if elected leaders abuse their power. And here the unfortunate thing is that a slim majority of Africans feel that way, that 53% feel the military should come in if their elected leaders abuse their power. Of course, the worrying trend here is that we have young people more inclined to think this way. That's 56% of people between 18 and 35 feel that the military should intervene if elected leaders abuse their power. All right, in terms of men, women, and youth issues, this is just talking about policy priorities. And Zainab asked, what are the policy priorities on the continent? Yes, unemployment has consistently been the policy priority on the continent, and especially among young people. That has been the key policy priority for young people. But what we've realized this time is economic management, like management of the economy. This used to be a very modest policy consideration. It used to be in the middle of the pack, below education. It is only this time we've seen it move up to second place and almost at par with unemployment. And so what this tells us, in this particular case, displacing health. Health used to be the second, and now management of the economy has moved up and topped that of health. And so as we think about policy implementations on the continent, even though COVID-19 may have ravaged the health systems on the continent, people now feel more strongly towards economic management than they do with health. And so that's just a key takeaway here. We do think that one of the key drivers of this has been either both the COVID-19 effects, but of course the ongoing war in Ukraine may have also driven this prioritization. All right, so quickly on gender issues, the top gender women's related issue on the continent for Africans is gender-based violence. And I hope people will pay attention to gender-based violence in any engagements on the continent. The second one being the number of women in influential positions. That is also another critical piece, but I think gender-based violence is the top policy priority when it comes to women's issues. The digital divide continues to be the same across the continent. Whether you're talking about access, ownership, and use of internet and mobile phones, women all consistently lag behind men across the continent in the latest survey. All right, so I'm now going to wind up, first of all, just to talk about the advancing pandemic recovery. Here, of course, when we ask about economic management across the continent, this has declined over time. There's been a strong drop in people's confidence in the management of the economy. I'm not surprised that that is what is reflected in the policy priorities. And of course, when it comes to who is responsible for climate change, and I know Ambassador Fee mentioned this, in terms of climate change, Africans see it as a shared responsibility. There's always this debate that, the rich worlds have caused climate change, they should be responsible, but that's not the case. And I just want to mention here that for those who are seeking to advance climate policy on the continent, they have some allies on the continent. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That round of applause, please. And to all of the panelists, I'm not favoring Joe. It's just that this is really insightful work that gets to the root of what African citizens prioritize in terms of policies, in terms of what they identify as problems and as solutions, and how they think about democracy and democratic norms and also institutions. Now I want to open up for questions and answers. So what we try to do here is we try to ensure that these events that we host are actually dialogues in the real sense of the word. And I want to make sure that as many people as possible have a chance to speak. In order for that to happen, please make your interventions very concise. If you go beyond 20 seconds, I'm going to interrupt you. We'll try to do 2 rounds. The first round, maybe we'll try to get 5 questions. So I'm going to start from here. Okay, the gentleman there. Please tell us your name and then your question, very concise.
Yes, so my name is Narupat Ratnakit. I'm a graduate student at American University. I would just like to ask about a question to you, sir. You just mentioned about Africans' opinion. Is there in the future that you would add about sanctions? Given that sanctions came out from the ECOWAS recently and African Union as well, will that be embedded in the future? Because that would be very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I think there was a lady here.
Thank you. Jeannie Tungara, Andrew Young Foundation. Thank you very much, panelists. My question has to do with education, higher education institutions in Africa and in the United States. Every once in a while I see the word education, but as far as your strategies go, where does higher education fit? And how can we get a piece of the things happening here to support African institutions?
Okay. Who else? Over there, that lady over there. Okay.
Hello, Amanda Cadlick. I had a question about the diaspora community and the concerns that I would think would be on the table when engaging with diaspora communities, because they tend to be elite class, upper class, and do tend to have a disconnect with local populations. I think the local populations that the U.S. is interested in engaging with directly. And the example I think of is Libya, when in 2011, Libyan diaspora was very vociferous in trying to get Western countries on board for the NATO intervention. And then local populations, once those elite diaspora communities supported the intervention, pushed back, and then there was a counter-revolution. So I'm curious to know if there are other interventions to engage local populations beyond diaspora communities here.
Great, thank you. The gentleman over here.
Thank you. My name is Zemedine Nagatu. I'm the chairman of a U.S. private equity firm that invests primarily in Africa. We run an investment bank as well, so mine is more related to the private sector. I wanted to ask any of the panelists about the recent BRICS decision to admit two African countries and a number of other countries that are considered to be normally strong allies of the United States. And the word is much of the world is frustrated with U.S. policies, and they were looking for an alternative. So perhaps if that's the case, because in Africa in particular, people think that the U.S. is reacting to China's, dominance of the continent as opposed to a genuine interest beyond security. So if you can answer that. And second is, obviously, we raise capital here in the U.S., we deploy it in Africa. We sometimes come across competition with sovereign wealth funds, whether it's in China, whether it's from the Gulf, whereas American companies cannot leverage U.S. sovereign to de-risk our businesses. So is there anything? I mean, I attended many of the events last December at the U.S. Africa Summit. There was a lot of discussion. We were happy, the $55 billion and all, but on the ground, we still don't really see that much that helps firms like us, that helps us, as I said, de-risk, especially the front end. Once we're up and running, so maybe from Judd and others, you can help us understand if there are any policies to help companies and investors like us. Thank you.
Great. Let's take one more. That lady over there. We'll come back. We'll do a second round.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Zena. I just wanted to come back to Ambassador Fee's comment on climate change. The government of Kenya just hosted Africa Climate Summit, and I happened to be in the hall when the U.S. Embassy was picking up their badges, and there were 124 people registered from the U.S. government. And Africa came out quite strongly with a declaration, the Nairobi Declaration, and for the first time has had an endorsed position on climate change. So just going back to your point that you would like the U.S. government to do more on climate change in Africa, what is that more?
Okay, so let's address those questions. Who wants to go first? Do you want to start?
Sure. Maybe I'll take the question about BRICS and de-risking. So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, I think, has talked about how we think about the BRICS. I mean, first of all, countries, it's their sovereign right to join whatever organizations that they want. It happens with BRICS that there are a number of key partners that are part of it. So I wouldn't see it as a rejection of the U.S. In fact, India, Brazil, South Africa, these are countries that we work very closely with on a range of issues. What I think is significant is that at the G20, President Biden, Prime Minister Modi, South African President Ramaphosa and President Lula, as well as Ajay Banga of the World Bank, recommitted to the G20 as a preeminent organization for economic cooperation. So while there is a BRICS and other countries join it, we have strong relationships with many of those countries, and those will continue. In terms of de-risking, this is a big effort across our government to facilitate more investment on the continent. So we were very pleased back in July to announce British Robinson as our new head, our new coordinator of Prosper Africa. Her job is to be sort of the front door to help companies to take advantage of all the different instruments that we have, whether it's the Development Finance Corporation or the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, lots more alphabet soup, XM. But we believe that this is a critical way in our value proposition is that our private sector isn't directed by the U.S. government, but is facilitated through a number of risk equity plays, insurance. So I would encourage you to connect with our Prosper Africa team, and they can point you to the right answer to your question.
Okay, Ambassador.
Sure. So let me start with the climate change question. So we were thrilled that Secretary Kerry attended that important conference, and that you had to pick up 150 badges. That's a great sign. And I think it's attributable both to the importance of Africa and climate change, but also I think to this emphasis that we're talking about here about engaging properly with Africa. We are doing positive types of activities. In South Africa, we have the Just Energy Transition Program. We just are about to launch a strategic energy dialogue with Nigeria, and helping Africans deal with adaptation, I think is really a critical area, as well as with the Congo rainforest. So we do have positive programs, and we have a historic USAID program in the Congo River Basin, which is really important. I just think it's such an overwhelming issue for us as a global community that it's probably there's probably an indefinite or infinite need, if you will, to engage more. But I am proud of the things we are doing. I think given the significance, it will be important to do even more across the board. On the question of education, I believe everyone would like us to see us do more in education. As you know, we have important programs already, such as the famous Fulbright program. We have visitor programs. We try and support HBCUs in engaging in Africa. We have a small partnership initiative in the Africa Affairs Bureau. Our Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs engages. But I have to tell you honestly, it's complicated because in the United States, our higher education system is so diverse, right? There's no single convening body, and it's also diverse in Africa. So doing the matchmaking can sometimes be challenging. And I keep looking, if you would like to take this on, I keep looking for an owner of that process, because I think the hunger is there, the need for shared research is there, as well as the educational exchange. We also had a shift in our own policymaking. USAID for years was heavily engaged in bringing students to the United States. Many great researchers in Africa had their start based on American universities. Support for American investment in foreign higher education atrophied, I think, in recent decades, although in certain specific research programs, particularly in food security, I do think there is still some important USAID engagement. So all to say is there are some very important and valuable programs, but I agree with you, the hunger is there, and the benefits to both sides are there. So that's an area where if we had more attention and more resources, I think we should do more. To agree. And then I just want a final point. The question on sanctions, was that for Joe as to whether or not Joe had tracked sanctions?
I think so.
I think so, yeah. Asking if they're going to add a module on sanctions. Yeah, in there. But Ambassador, if there's something you want to add too.
No, you go ahead. That would those were just the ones I was going to address.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I
then we'll
believe
come
you are
to-
talking about sanctions on government, for example, if there's a military regime and the sanctions from the African Union and other bodies. That's a good question to ask. We haven't explored that yet. Usually, we ask questions at a point where a policy issue is in the public consciousness to the extent that when we ask an ordinary person roaming the street, they'll be able to give us some response. And so over time, as this becomes an important issue, certainly we would ask it. I can imagine that it's very relevant for academics like yourself. But I just wanted to ask Molly, the point about education.
Before I want to do
yeah,
education,
okay.
but I just want to add an observation on sanctions. I think there's some confusion sometimes about what we mean by sanctions, because they can be individual sanctions like visa sanctions or sanctions for corruption. But we have very important influence where we effectively sanction a government, particularly through the withholding of our development assistance, our security assistance, our support for World Bank projects, IMF support, African Development Bank. So I think it's a mistake to equate the use of economic pressure only to an individual sanction, because the role of the United States, I think, in these major financial endeavors also equates to enormous economic pressure. And we try and use that pressure to mobilize government action. But Joe, over to you on education.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so that actually clarifies one other point for me, that in terms of sanctions, we've asked about generalized sanctions, for example, whether it is sanctions from economic sanctions from the IMF or the World Bank and the like on the continent, which we do have data on. So we do have data on that. Is when it comes to African governments or institutions on illegitimate governments, maybe. That's something we haven't asked about. But on education, I just wanted to underscore the fact that I haven't presented that data here, but the young people are the most educated, but they're the least employed. Mm-hmm. And so it does create this dynamic of where do you go? Because investing in education without opportunities for employment then creates a bottleneck in terms of what you can actually do in investing in education. Not to discourage investment in education, but just to highlight the point that that's what we have in the data.
I want to bring in Ambassador Carson on the diaspora.
Sure, absolutely. The Diaspora Council will set its own agenda, and I think that they will be focused along a broad range of topics and issues. I would suspect that they will want to talk about business, investment, and trade. I think they'll probably also want to talk about digital technology and innovation. They will want to talk about issues of culture and creative arts. All of these are the kinds of topics that I would think would come to the minds of those individuals who are there. They will not be setting U.S. foreign policy. That will remain very much in the hands of the State Department and the White House, but they will in fact be sharing thoughts and ideas along a broad perspective and on a range of issues.
Can I just,
their meetings I might also add, their meetings are open to the public under, they will be listed in the Federal Registry and they will be open to the public, but they do set their own agenda.
I wanted to add to Professor Tungara's question. One of our members we're really thrilled is Dr. Helene Gale, the president of Spelman. So perhaps she can do some advising on us on the university engagement as well, given that she's the head of it at HBCU. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let's take another round, and then we'll start with Ambassador Kanza when we're responding to the questions. We're going to start from that gentleman over there.
Thank you, panelists. My name is Marco Pelulu-Rock. I'm the founder of the Global Leadership Africa Summit. So my question to you guys, in the midst of all the events that's happening in Africa, all the coup, everything, we noticed there's rejection from people of Africa toward the West, not trusting the West that much, you know. So what is the U.S. is doing currently to bring trust to Africa?
The gentleman in red over there at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Lawrence Freeman. I've been involved in economic development policy for Africa for over 30 years. Been there, traveled to the continent every couple of months. But my point is, I saw on the barometer that water supply and infrastructure were number 4 and 5. And these are the areas I think that I like to know what the U.S. policy is in those areas. I like the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. I like the BRICS. I'm happy that 3 African countries will be part of the BRICS. They have a development bank of their own. But the United States has facilities, has reinsurance, but it doesn't actually make sure that there are government extended credit for infrastructure. Infrastructure is killing Africa, and many Africans tell me that's why they don't like or trust the United States, is they will not build the kind of economic development in electricity and railroads and water that make a difference in their lives. So I'd like to know how we are changing that.
Thank you. This lady here in green, Graceland.
Thanks, Ina. My name is Graceland Vaskren. I'm the Research Director and Senior Fellow for Energy Security and Climate at Center for Strategic and International Studies down the road. There has been accelerating mineral diplomacy on the African continent quite recently. Tanzania's graphite reserves are listed in the Department of Energy's 2023 critical minerals. We see they're there in the graphite sector. But there's a lot of pressure to make mining more beneficial to, bilaterally beneficial in a way that it hasn't. How is the U.S. approaching this as it takes on a more aggressive minerals diplomacy?
Okay. The gentleman beside her, Amir.
Thanks.
We'll try to take as many as possible, and we probably won't answer all of them, but you get a chance to speak, and I don't get hate mail.
Hopefully. Amir Labdioui from the Associate Professor at the University of Oxford. So about the RA, it has broken the taboo of industrial policy. African nations want to industrialize. For reasons mentioned in the opening remarks, it's in everyone's benefit that this industrialization is as green and low carbon as possible. So what exactly is the US willing to do in terms of low carbon technology transfer and support for green industrialization in Africa?
Okay. The gentleman there. Yeah. And then, so you can see what.
Thank you. My name is Ibrahim Oziri Jr., and I'm with Microsoft. Judd, in your opening remarks, you highlighted U.S. interest or role in defining Africa's emerging technology and cyber, which I actually believe is significant, especially after reviewing the DTA initiative. Can you let us know if there are any progress, like has there been any progress in that aspect, and also if U.S. is facing any blockers?
Okay. Oh gosh. Sorry, we'll have to move here. Apologies. The lady. There were 2 ladies, so I was.
My question is very quick. The ambassador, Marley Fee, said earlier that there's a strategic energy dialogue with Nigeria, and I just wondering if you tell us more about that. Thank you.
Okay, the lady behind her.
Thank you. My name is Lily Bashard, and my question has to do with the fundamentals Ambassador Fee mentioned earlier. In terms of progress and monitoring progress around governance and rule of law, how do we, what is the plan how do we monitor that progress? And I think that's an area where, if we're looking at what's happened in West Africa, I think unless we address the fundamentals, then, anything we do can crumble in a day. So how do we measure that? And perception surveys are great, but how do we measure that in a real way that can make a difference? Thank you.
Okay, just one more here. It's going to be one of you, so you, sir.
Sylvester Osage, I'm the Director of Sub-Saharan Africa Engagement at Penn State and also the Faculty Fulbright Advisor. Now, Ambassador Carson, I attended a meeting. I first met you at the Virginia Military Institute. Years ago, there was a meeting there that talked about the role of the US and China in Africa, how to avoid competition between the 2 institutions. Considering what is going on today, I wanted to find out what you think in light of the discussions that we had at that meeting. Now, Joseph, we've always said that the global north contributes the most to climate change? And you've just talked about allies in Africa, so I wanted to know more about that.
Thank you. We'll take just 2 more from this side. So I have 4 o'clock. JT?
Thanks, Zainab. JT, John Tomaszewski, you work for Senate Foreign Relations Committee. My question is, Judd, Mali, when you looked at the strategy, the grouping of democracy and security are together. And of course, a lot of the conversations that you're having with governments are with heads of state who may or may not respond very favorably to certain comments that you might make regarding the strengthening of democracy. Notably, at the Africa Leaders Summit, you had a number of heads of state who don't necessarily stand for the most credible elections or have served for a long time. How have, since you've had those tough conversations, those frank conversations since ALS, how have you seen some changes or some impact from those conversations? Thank you.
Okay, great. Just very quickly, and that's it. We'll have
Hi.
to close.
Thanks, everyone. Kate with Amnesty International. Joe's presentation made some really important points around backsliding around media freedom, increased corruption. However, I did not hear human rights mentioned by any of the panelists as a central focus of the Africa strategy, and would like to know why that was omitted, given kind of how Afrobarometer has shown some of the key issues that are facing African citizens and civil society. Thanks.
Okay, great. So we're going to take 2 minutes to try to address as many of the questions as possible. But I want to start with Ambassador Kanza, especially around minerals and Tanzania, because your country specifically was mentioned. Then we'll come back this way.
Well, very specifically with respect to the critical minerals and rare earth metals agenda, and you're sitting next to Whitney, who we were with last week, talking very much about how to ensure that the African voice and Africans don't have African resources being talked about without Africans being present. And so that's a general concern that the source countries have not been involved actively in the dialogue that's been taking place about this transition, the clean energy transition, and how to leverage and better optimize the sourcing of these minerals from countries like Tanzania, which is very rich, actually, in that regard, but we're equally concerned about the neighborhood. And in that respect, we border 8 countries, 6 of which are landlocked, and quite a few of which, particularly in southern Africa and central, are mineral rich as well. So we're equally concerned about how we facilitate them from an infrastructure point of view, but then also when you think about processing, it's not going to be possible to establish processing hubs in every single country. And so how can we create centers of excellence? And with respect to the U.S. government in particular, we've had a number of conversations with Undersecretary Jose Fernandez and his team. As a country, we have active engagement at the moment in terms of areas of collaboration, including reviewing our overall strategy, but also thinking through how we can have more value addition, which is the biggest outcry from the source countries, that we do not want to repeat the past. We need to have some beneficiation. You have countries like Namibia and Zimbabwe that have already put bans in place. We do not believe as a country that we're in that position. We're also seeing competition from traditional partners, including from the West. We have no exclusivity. The interest has to be the people and how the country is able to benefit from these resources. But more importantly, as we look at why this interest has grown in these minerals, is how we can build sustainable industries, how we can uphold ESG principles. So it's not just about being green, but how do we respect and ensure that the right labor standards are in place, traceability. As you know, there's a lot of corruption in the mineral industry, let's just be frank about it. But how do we adopt better principles as we continue to work together, and what is the future of what the mining industry looks like, but also clean energy industries?
And I want to add that we have a report coming out probably Friday this week on how Africa can join U.S. clean energy supply chains, where we talk about the discussion around minerals and also other opportunities that we see for Africa with respect to the clean climate-related legislations that have been passed recently in the U.S., the IRA, Chips and Science Act, as well as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Okay, I think I got it right this time. So be on the lookout. Probably on Friday, it should be out. We have to conclude. Now I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds to give their final remarks by responding to any of the questions posed or anything else they want to say before we close. Dr. Asunka, you want to start first?
Right, yeah, so I'll start with thanks for the question about climate change. It's a big topic on the continent, but the idea that the West or global advanced economies have contributed more, so they should be responsible, is not a shared idea on the continent. Most people feel like it is a shared responsibility between themselves, their governments, the private sector, and the developed world. But most people actually put it on themselves and their governments. It's just in Tunisia that they think it is a developed world, and in Nigeria and Niger that puts it all on their governments, but all across on average, people think it's a shared responsibility.
Okay. Ambassador Kanza, any other?
Yes, AGOA. Yes, it's coming up to an end of its current run. On 2025, we're calling for an early renewal. We hear the calls for some modification, but as long as it does not hold us back from renewing it as soon as possible, preferably for 10 years. Molly's heard me before, and Judd would just appeal for the support as we also take this up with Congress, that we all, are rowing the boat in the same direction and preferably with the same speed that we would, on optimal speed. Thank you.
Excellent. Ambassador Carson?
President Biden's Diaspora Engagement Council will elevate African voices and issues in this administration and allow those voices to engage more actively across a broad spectrum of issues of concern to the diaspora in this country and African countries abroad.
Ambassador Fee?
I want to address the fundamental and vital issue of human rights. And I use the term governance, and to me, that is shorthand to include, and this is Judd and I feel very strongly about this, we feel the absence of an inclusive governance which respects human rights leads to instability. And that's why we paired the two. So I just don't want there to be any misunderstanding of our commitment to human rights and to, as JT said, frank conversations about these issues. And all of us in this room play a role, whether we're diplomatically engaging, whether we're using public pressure, whether we're using private pressure, economic pressure. And I just want to reassure you of that. And I apologize if my shorthand use of governance appeared to suggest erroneously a lack of commitment.
Well, since I'm the last one, I'll just say we are thrilled to have this dialogue with you, and we've been having it since before the strategy was written, and it's something that the constant feedback, the critiques, sometimes applause, but mainly a strong dialogue is the only way that we're going to have a policy that makes sense for our government and our people, and for African governments and African people. So having a platform like this, hearing from you, getting WhatsApps, emails, or yelling, all of those are accepted as long as it gets us to a place where we have a better policy. So thank you so much.
Great. On
Thank
that
you
note,
to you, Zainab.
Yes.
Thank you for honoring the invitation. This has been fantastic, informative, insightful. We're very, very grateful, and also to the audience, full house. Everybody stayed in their seats, and they kept their questions short and concise. Thank you very much, and more importantly, thank you to my colleagues at Carnegie, the Carnegie Africa program, and IT comms who toiled behind the scenes for weeks to make this happen. Blaine Solomon, Andrew Danek, Saskia Holman, Erica Hogan, Zach, Ed, Mira, and others. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
This could have gone on for